Hello, friends, and welcome back to Stories About Entitled People. I find it ridiculous that people think that making unreasonable demands under the guise of needing to understand where they're coming from has become de rigueur. Not to mention his actual concern is just flat out nutty, paranoid, and a bit creepy. More right after a short pause. So before we begin, best way to support our channel is to leave comments, like, and subscribe with a turned-on bell so you don't miss the new video every single day. Here we go. Told my neighbor to get effed when he told me to remove my doorbell camera. So lately there's been a number of burglaries in the area I live in. My wife and I were among those who got burglarized, and most of the stuff we lost were packages and electronics. My wife and I both work long hours, so we're not home most of the time, and despite taking precautions, we're still concerned for the safety of our belongings as well as other things. So I decided to get a doorbell camera, which frankly has become a necessity, and it's cheap to buy, $199, and easy to install. And so far, we were able to catch a number of thieves in act. To my surprise, some of them I knew personally and were from the area, which helped a lot in getting our stuff back. On to the issue. So my neighbor and I were discussing this with a few other neighbors, and I showed him a video that was taken by the camera to explain how we were able to identify the individuals who tried to steal stuff. I was fast-forwarding the footage, but he suddenly freaked out and pointed at his wife who was at the door to visit my wife. I was confused when he asked how long I'd been keeping this video and if I made copies of it. He then proceeded to tell me it didn't feel right to see his wife being recorded by the doorbell cam, and the fact that I didn't get rid of this part since it had nothing to do with catching the thieves made him uncomfortable. I apologized for any misunderstanding and promised it had nothing to do with his wife. We had a few people stand at our door who were shown on our cam, so I wasn't just his wife. He cut the conversation and left, then came back in the evening to ask for how long I will be keeping the camera. I asked why. He said he wasn't sure about his wife being recorded and asked me to remove it. I said no. Then he suggested I install one inside, but I still said no. He got all pissed and said that I was acting inappropriately and mean after he came to me with his concerns, expecting me to understand that he doesn't want me having footages of his wife. I told him his wife can stop coming over if he was so worried, but he went on about never telling his wife what to do or where to go. He insisted I remove the cam, but I told him to get effed and never bring this up again. He left and got others involved. They told me I should be more considerate of my neighbor's feelings and understand where he's coming from, but I stood my ground and refused to remove the camera. My wife thinks I was being a jerk to our neighbor and his wife and have some respect for them, but I don't think I was being disrespectful. And our second story. You're not allowed to approve rental cars. This takes place when I was in the Air Force and was Assistant Director of Operations in my squadron. Basically, that means I was third in the squadron and in charge of the day-to-day operation of a C-17 flying squadron. It's not uncommon for me to be the highest-ranking person available in the squadron on a given day, as was the case this week. God help us all. Normally, either the Director of Operations or Commander was supposed to be around, but due to extenuating circumstances, it was just me that week. The commander, not wanting to deal with having to sign rental car approval letters whenever someone went on temporary duty elsewhere, had delegated that authority down to me. One of our staff sergeants was going away for about 3 weeks to attend protocol school and some other training, basically training in all the minutiae of interacting with VIPs, high-ranking generals, congressmen, whatever. Every base has a protocol section to deal with that, and you have to attend the school first. As he was staying off base, I signed the letter authorizing him a rental car and forwarded the travel approval on up. About half an hour later, I get a call from the operations group, composed of the Flying Squadrons and Flying Support Squadron, resource advisor. She goes off about how I'm not allowed to approve rental cars, there isn't money for them, and there's a shuttle to the school from the hotel. I argue that there's not. She doesn't listen and insists there is, the rental car's denied, and I don't have the authority to authorize one anyway. Fine. I call the hotel and confirm that there is indeed no shuttle. The hotel's also not near any food. I resubmit the travel authorization with the taxi to and from the campus every day, and then one for dinner in the evening. I then authorize a taxi out and back to a restaurant for lunch and dinner on the weekends. It ends up being $640 a week in taxis versus $200 at the governmental rental car rate. I resubmit the travel authorization. A call comes in half hour later asking why the trip was now significantly more expensive. I explained I called the hotel and confirmed no shuttle. Only then does she realize he's staying off base and tells me, "Go ahead and resubmit the travel authorization with the rental car approval." "Sorry, I'm not authorized to approve a rental car. You'll need to draft a letter for the group commander, full colonel, to sign, authorizing a car and rewrite the authorization if you want him to use a rental car." And our next story. The contract says what it says. Back in the mid-2000s, I managed the IT contacts for a large company. They were purchased by an even larger company, and it became my job to renegotiate and assign the licensing and maintenance contracts to the new company. Most were agreeable, but the three biggest software companies saw it as a cash grab. This was about the time software licenses were moving from a per seat to a per processor model. The giants wanted to enforce that change. I'd already done the work and figured out head count versus processor count and which heads needed access, so I knew what we were paying for more than was necessary. The first giant shut up when I told him we would remove the software from the 90% of machines not using it, and they could have their per processor licenses and the corresponding maintenance adjustment. The company buying us dropped their licenses and absorbed our overage the next year. The second giant agreed to a steep discount on the change in licenses if we didn't touch the maintenance contract. The third was having none of it, and we actually mostly used the software. Alongside the change in licenses, they insisted on attaching the usual increase in maintenance fees for the entire company, not just the division being purchased, to a specific consumer price index. In the end, we wound up paying a very minimal fee, about $1,000, to get things done ahead of a regulatory deadline for the purchase of the company. The next year was ugly. We went several rounds about the exact amount of maintenance because the CPIU gets adjusted after the fact. We paid them, then they credited us when the number changed twice. The account rep got ugly, and their last email to me was, "The contract says what it says." At the end of year one, the housing market collapsed. For the first time ever, the CPIU was negative. Edit to add clarity by request, the contract was written as fees shall be equal to the designated CPIU. Whatever the CPI said, that was the percentage of the software cost to be paid as the fee for maintenance and support services. Cue the malicious compliance. Giant 3 was sent a bill for over $1 million US. Yes, it was that big a contract. The account rep called, screaming his head off, and I told him the contract says what it says. Please put your concerns in an email I can discuss with the bosses. He did, and I was able to hand the whole thing off to the legal department. 2 weeks later, legal hosts a meeting. Giant 3 has given us a new rep, an agreement to pay the full amount in quarterly installments, and wants to revisit the contract. The meeting was quick and very much to the company's benefit. Afterwards, I was offered a position in legal doing more of the same, but declined as I was starting my own consulting business. I still consult with them occasionally, which is how this came up. And our last story, shutting off neighbors' water. So this isn't my story, this is my dad's. I was a kid, and this saga basically spanned the whole 90s. I grew up on a small street that back in the day was a small neighborhood of 14 houses surrounded by horse pastures. It's since been developed all around, but it was pretty quiet when I was growing up. The neighborhood had a small well that serviced the houses, and they had a small well association, mini HOA, that took care of it. It was a great deal, $40 a month, and you got as much water as you wanted. The neighbor at the end of the street was a paralyzed woman in a wheelchair. Let's call her Laura. Before you feel bad for her, she was paralyzed by driving drunk/high and getting in a car accident. She was also a dealer and frequently had criminals at her house. I'm talking hardened, violent criminals with warrants. Every few months, we would knock on the doors and it would be a cop warning us to stay inside because they were raiding her house. My neighbor up the street was a small-time jeweler, and she had 2 cops posing as a married couple looking at jewelry, but were actually collecting info from the neighbors and getting surveillance. Somehow, they never were able to nail Dora, just her friends. Well, even though the water was cheap, Dora decided to stop paying her bill. After 3 years of not paying, the Well Association decided to turn off her water. They sent my dad over to do it. first he just turned it off. There's a shutoff for each house in a ground box. They turned it back on. He then turned it off with a lock. They cut the lock and turn it back on. He then cuts out 12 inches of pipe, caps it, shuts off the water with a lock. They cut the lock, turn the valve, then complain to the association that they have no water. No crap. The association told them to pay up. They responded by breaking the back windshield of my dad's car and later stealing it. This is the crazy part. They lived without running water for almost 3 years. They used the outside as their toilet. I don't want to know what the inside looked like. They were never less than 3 adults living in that house at a time, including Dora, so you can imagine how bad it got. Dora complained constantly, saying she was getting gangrene, etc. Obviously not true, but I'm sure health wasn't great. Ironically, it wasn't the cops or lack of water that got rid of her at the end of the day. It was the bank. They stopped paying their mortgage and tried to sell. My dad made sure to tell every person who visited it about it being a D-dealer house. I don't think they cooked there, but they sure did sell. No one was buying, and the bank foreclosed on the house, left Dora with nothing. The new owners paid the lien on the water. My dad hooked up the water again. The new owners fixed and flipped the house, and the current owners have been there ever since. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.